Don't know what's going on with this label, but I guess it's got the seal of approval. Welcome back, Whisky fans. So I decided to throw in a young entry from my local distillery here in Norfolk, because why not? So the English Whisky Company has been around for quite a while now. It's not exactly a definition of a new distillery. Some of these have only been around 3-4 years. Ardent American's only been around since 2014, and that's kind of getting to the point where it's no longer new. So English Whisky Company is the old man of the lineup. But this is a 5-year-old single grain whisky. Is it cheating that I'm putting an entry from my home distillery in when they've been around for significantly longer than everyone else? Yeah, probably, but it's my channel, so I can do that. So, the Norfolk is kind of the English Whisky Company's line of single grain whiskies. The definition of single grain is a whisky where it's either not 100% malted barley in the mash bill, or a whisky where they use column stills, continuous stills, or coffee stills, as opposed to pot stills, which we'd normally use for a single malt. Now, the famous example at the moment, the one that's getting a lot of attention and exposure, and my whisky of the year last year, is Loch Lomond. They've got a range of single grain whiskies, and their single grains are grain whiskies because they use 100% malted barley, as you would do in a single malt, but they run it through their continuous stills, which means that they're not allowed to call it a single malt. It's close to single malt because you're using the same materials, but the still means that it's a grain. With this one, it's the opposite end of the spectrum. With this one, they're still using pot stills, but they're using a multi-grain mash bill. So we don't know what the mash bill is on this one. There may or may not be some malted barley in there. We don't know, and if there is, we don't know what percentage it is, but we know that there are several grains in this one other than malted barley. So with these grain whiskies, which are sort of non-traditional modern grain whiskies, it's often hard to tell the differences with what you're nosing and tasting. It's hard to tell what is down to the different stills or what's down to the different mash bills with some grain whiskies. I think that this one, it should give us some clues. It should give us a little bit more of an A-B comparison, because this one we can compare the English Whisky Company pot still single malt, their normal stuff, to the English Whisky Company pot still grain. And then something else I want to do when I eventually get around to reviewing some Loch Lomond, with them we'll be able to compare pot still single malt whisky to column still single malt with Loch Lomond, which you can bet I will absolutely be doing. Back to this one that we're looking at today though. As I said, these whiskies with the seal in the hat, used to be a cat in the hat. They have moved on to the seal now, but these whiskies branded as the Norfolk are the English Whisky Company or St George's Distillery. These guys based in Rydham in Norfolk. It's their line of grain whiskies. Why the seal? I do actually know that, and I didn't realise when I first saw this. It's because Norfolk is actually home to a really large percentage of the seal colonies in the British Isles. It's incredibly common to see them here in Norfolk, and I didn't actually realise until I started looking into this and I asked why they've got the seal on the label. It's actually not that common to see seals around the British Isles, that we have more than our fair share of them here in Norfolk. And I think I've covered the bowler hat before, the cook hat or the coke hat. The bowler hat was actually invented in Norfolk. It was originally a rigid, almost safety hat for horse riding, invented in Norfolk a very long time ago. Obviously exported around the world, and now kind of seen as an upper or upper middle class businessman attire sort of thing, which is very different to what it was in the original days. It is more of a working class thing, a country pursuits hat. And the bowler hat, originally from Norfolk, is also, if you see any photos from the Wild West, from the early days of the frontier in America, it was a very popular hat back in those days, much more popular than the Stetson that we see in Hollywood cowboy films. This is more like what they would have been wearing back then. So it's good that there's a little bit of local history and local pride there being tied in with a label and tied in with a whiskey from where the whiskey is from. What actually goes into the bottle with this one? We know that it's a mash bill of 7 different grains. So definitely not just malted barley and a little bit of wheat or rye or whatever. It's a complex, very complicated and varied mash bill. I have asked what the grains are that go into the mash bill on this one, and I've been told that it's a trade secret. But with 7 different grains going into this one, we can probably take a pretty good educated guess as to what goes in this one. We're obviously not going to know the proportions, but with 7 different grains in there, you're likely to have possibly some malted barley, possibly some unmalted barley, probably rye. English Whisky Company have done lots of experiments and expressions already with rye in the mash bill. Possibly some wheat, possibly some maize or sweet corn, because that's something that ferments very easily. Possibly some oats. Quinoa is something that various distilleries have attempted to turn into whiskey. Possibly something like spelt, perhaps unmalted barley. There are quite a few things that can be used, different grains that can be used to turn into a distilled spirit. But there's not that many different ones, so you're probably not going to be that far off if you pick 7 out of that list. Details from the label on this one, I'll just show you that wonderful label, if that'll come into focus. So they're calling this one Farmers, so that's to differentiate it from some of the other single grains that have done in the past. They've actually done this, but at 45% in the past with a cat on the label, and a green label, that was called Farmers as well, just at a lower strength. They've done one with barley and rye, and they've done one with torrefied grains. And they've also done the 9-year-old rye whiskey, which I've reviewed very recently. This is a single cask release. I'll just show you the rear label where it says that this is a non-chill filtered release from Norfolk. Doesn't say anywhere on the label that this is natural colour, and I'm really disappointed with the English Whisky Company in Norfolk for not putting that on there. Like a lot of distilleries, they obviously think that it doesn't matter, or people don't need to know, or they're not wondering perhaps, but we are, and we do like to know, and it does matter, and it makes a difference as to whether we buy a whiskey if we know that it definitely is natural colour. I have talked to the English Whisky Company, and they've reassured me that this and all of their releases are natural colour and non-chill filtered, even the 43% stuff. But we really do want to see that on the label, because that's where it matters, and that's our guarantee that nothing's going to change. The price of this one is a little bit high, or it seems a little bit high. I paid £62 for this, but you might have realised that it's only a 500ml bottle, so it's not a full 700. So it seems a little bit expensive, but you have to remember that this is a cask strength release. It's also single cask, and it's also a very, very small batch release. There's actually only 441 bottles of this stuff. I've got bottle number 411 out of 441. It's batch B30278, matured in American oak, bottled in June 2022. So when you see some other distilleries saying that something is small batch or limited edition, when you look at something like an Octomore, something from Bruichladdich, some of their limited edition batches might be 10,000 or tens of thousands of bottles. You'll quite often see a small batch release in the thousands of bottles. This is literally just 441 bottles, and they're small bottles, so this is really, really small batch limited release stuff. I actually believe that it's not only single cask, but I think they've only ever bottled one cask of this stuff. So there's been one cask of this kind of experimental grain whiskey. They've bottled it, and that's all there is. So bearing in mind all of that it's cask strength and such a small batch experimental thing, I think that the price does even out a little bit, especially when you consider that this stuff is 56.1%. But still, yeah, you are getting a small bottle, and you're paying a little bit of a high price for it. So let's get some in the glass and see if it has got the Whisky Lock seal of approval. And as always, I am going to show you the colour of that one, because I am reassured that this is natural colour, even though they haven't guaranteed it on the label, and it's non-chill filtered as well. Also interesting to know that this is matured in American oak, so you've not got any virgin oak or wine casks or anything influencing and darkening the colour of that. So that's what naturally presented whiskey should look like. Is that lighter or different than what you would get with a single malt mash bill? I'd say probably not. It looks pretty much what I would expect. So let's see how it noses. So on the nose, light. Definitely a light, delicate. I'm not going to go as far as saying it's closed, but it's a light and delicate, smooth and refined nose. Kind of similar to the kind of light and refined character that we had on the nose of the White Peaks Wireworks. Probably not quite as light, but similar. There's a delicate floral sweetness to the nose of this one. Some more of those citrus notes, so again that's something that it's got in common with the Wireworks. Specifically in the citrus category with this one, I would say tangerines, but more of a sweet tangerine note rather than a sharp acidic tangerine. There's also a little bit of peach on the nose of this one. Quite effervescent on the sweetness. Something like refreshers, you know, those crumbly chalk sweets, love hearts, that sort of thing. Definitely a slightly soapy effervescence on the nose, as well as a subtle spiciness, and I wonder if that might be coming through from some rye in the mash bill, but definitely smooth and light. There's a creamy vanilla graininess on the nose as well, and I wonder if those smooth creamy notes might be coming through possibly from some wheat in the mash bill. And obviously when you get something like this, when you know that it's a multi-grain mash bill but you don't know what it is, you obviously go looking for things and trying to confirm what you're looking for. And I was trying to see if there's any of those sort of textbook Irish biscuity shortbread notes possibly coming through from some unmalted barley, but not really. It's definitely a strong cereally backbone to this one, but really more about that creamy graininess and that sort of spicy rye spice type note. But you can definitely tell that it's not your average single malt. It's definitely something different to that. I think you can tell that there are different grains gone into this, and there's a very, very strong and obvious grainy cereal note through and through this. Also getting your probably expected and stereotypical bourbon honeyed vanilla notes, and that's probably coming through from the fact that this is matured in American oak, so you can probably assume that that's coming from an ex-bourbon cask, especially when you consider that we know there's 441 bottles of this and it's single cask, so you're looking at around about 200 litres output, so that sounds about plausible for one bourbon cask. Amongst all of those creamy, grainy notes, I'm also getting a faintly musty note and actually slightly farmy. And I'm not saying that there's any peat to this, but it makes you wonder if it is possibly created after they'd made a peated batch, because they obviously make peated whiskey at the English Whisky Company. So maybe a little bit of residual phenol coming through from the smoke and phenols and that farminess that's just in the equipment from the batch before. Let's see how it tastes. On the palate, right up front on the palate, on the attack of it, more of those tangerine notes, sweet and orangey, a little bit of sharp acidity but not too much, really is a sweet, like strong fruit squash, and probably a slight saltiness on the palate as well. Definitely got a good backbone to it. It's not a light and inoffensive grain whiskey where you barely know that you're tasting it. It's got a good saltiness, salinity, a pleasant dry oaky edge, and more of those dry cereally grain notes. I think that there's less of that spice on the palate of this than I was getting on the nose. What I thought might have been coming through from some rye in the mash bill, getting less of that on the palate. But it's got really good body, really good intensity, and I think that that's probably evidence of those pot stills that I've used to make this. I think that if they'd used that multi-grain mash bill and used a column still, which as far as I know they haven't got at the English Whisky Company, but if they had run this through column stills, I think it would be much simpler and lighter I think the fact that they have batch distilled this in pot stills has really helped to keep some of that intensity in there, and it's got a very pleasant astringency too. I'm just going to have one more sip of this and then look at the finish, but I'm also going to do something else. I am tasting this at full cask strength of 56.1, and I have tried this with water, but I'm just going to add a couple of drops in here again and just have a look at what difference that makes. So I'll probably put about 4 millilitres of water in there, no more. So this is how I add water. If it's any whiskey actually, I was going to say if it's a high strength whiskey, but even more important, if it's a low strength whiskey, you don't want to be putting too much water in there. You can always add more later, but you can't really take it out. So this is about the amount that I would add to a whiskey at full 56%. So that's probably more than I would normally add. Actually, I slipped a little bit there. But let's just give that a little second to take that in, settle down, marry, open up. So being a non-chill filtered whiskey, you'd probably expect a little bit of haze here. But saying that, I've probably not taken it down below 50%, so probably not too much. But I think you can see a little bit already. You can see that that's gone ever so slightly cloudier than it was. So the finish of this one, where I took that little sip before, I'm going to say light, medium, short on the finish. And I think that's possibly down to that multi-grain mash bill. It just hasn't got the body to carry a long finish like a 100% malted barley spirit possibly would. But lots of cereal notes in there on the finish, and more of that salty, astringent edge. So I obviously haven't given this too long to marry there, but let's just give it a little nose, see if we've made any difference there. That has really opened the nose up quite a bit. Much more floral now, more perfumed. I don't know if I said floral on the nose before, I think I probably did. But floral, perfumed, actually a little bit of a kind of aftershavey note, and that sounds not great, but trust me, it is. Kind of spicy, ethanol-y, pungent, that kind of pleasant aftershave quality. So yeah, I think that water has really opened it up. Much more floral notes and just a lot more complex. Let's see how it tastes. I think adding the water on the palate of this one, it's made it much more approachable. I think it's taken a little bit of the astringency, a little bit of the salty, dry quality from this has disappeared a little bit, toned back a little bit on the palate, but it's brought in a lot of peach, sort of soft fruit notes, white fruits. Peach is not something that I'm always welcome to see in a whiskey, because I think especially a lot of Irish whiskies, I think peach is quite often the sign of a slightly immature or young whiskey, and it may be the case that at only 5 years old that peach is something that would disappear if it was a bit older, but it's by no means an unpleasant note. As for the finish with water, probably less cereal notes on the finish now. It's just smoothed it out, it's less sharp, less intense, but it's kind of rounded it out and opened it up. So, in my opinion, this one, 56% or with a little bit of water, works fantastic either way. It's always good to see a whiskey where you have got that option of lowering the ABV if you choose to, and it's always a little bonus when it turns into something else, develops a little bit when you do so. So obviously I've reviewed the English Whisky Company Norfolk, the 9-year-old rye whiskey not so long ago, so obviously I need to say what it's like compared to that one. And I think that this is much more to my liking than that 9-year-old rye whiskey. I think that this one hasn't quite got the testicular fortitude, as Jeff from G Whiskey would say, but it's got a lot of complexity. It's beautifully delicate and interesting. It might not have the raw power of that 9-year-old rye whiskey, but in my humble opinion, it's more interesting and more complex and just a better whiskey. And I do love that hard, dry cereal note. So as for a grade on this one, I'm going to go with a solid B, with the slight disclaimer that anyone considering getting this is not your run-of-the-mill single malt. I'd say that it's not even like any other grain whiskey that I've ever tried. It's quite different to single malts and grain whiskies, and it does require a little bit of an adventurous, open mind. So what about the difference between this and the 100% malted barley single malt products coming from the English Whisky Company? I do think that you can taste the influence of that multi-grain mash bill coming through on this one. I think that you can taste that they've got all those different grains in there with the slightly spicy notes, which I assume is rye, the creaminess. I think you can just tell that you've got a full choir singing here rather than just the soprano. But when you compare this to other single grains and stuff like the single grains from Loch Lomond, which are made with malted barley in a column still, I think that this is closer to your traditional single malt than any of those others. And I think that's because of those stills. I think that when you run any spirit through column stills, it, in my opinion, pulls it further away from the single malt style than just throwing in some different grains into the mash bill. Now, a lot of people, including myself if we're honest, think that malted barley is the king of distilled spirits. When you compare, obviously famously, a Scotch, which is made with 100% malted barley, single malt, when you compare that to a bourbon or an American whiskey, it's pretty obvious that you do get more complexity, and the spirit just has a greater ability being made from that 100% malted barley to take on different flavours. You can shape it into making the whiskey that you want to, whereas with, in my opinion and other people's opinion, when you start off with a bourbon mash bill, you're more likely to get the same result out of the end, or a similar result to what other people are getting from those materials. With this one, you get lots of different notes from all of those different grains. You're getting smooth and well-matured grains, spicy grains, dry grains. So in a way, I think that this adds interest over what you would get with 100% malted barley. But yeah, I do think you also lose something in exchange. In particular, and this is just complete theory, just a complete guess, it's my feeling that this stuff, I do wonder if the reason why they've bottled this at 5 years old is possibly because they, like me, think that this might not benefit as much from extra aging. But I think what we've got here, I think that it justifies the price, and I think that it's really interesting, and it justifies the single grain category as a valid category of whiskey. And more than that, I really like the experimentation they've done in here, just as I love the experimentation that they're doing with single grain over at Loch Lomond. So I think that both of them are not only justifying, but they're kind of redefining what single grain is and what single grain can be. So thanks for watching this one. Let me know in the comments what you think of single grain. What's the best single grain you've had? And do you think that is something that has big potential for the future? Thanks for watching, and cheers.